"This seat is reserved for Mr. Peterson. You don't belong here. Learn your place." Flight attendant Jessica Matthews stood over a well-dressed black woman, her voice sharp and filled with rage as she pointed aggressively toward the exit. Those were the words that destroyed Jessica Matthews' entire career in just 10 seconds. "I don't care what your ticket says," Jessica screamed, her face turning red with fury. "This is first class, and you clearly don't belong here. Security needs to remove you immediately." The woman sitting calmly in the expensive seat was Victoria Williams. She wore a perfectly tailored designer suit that probably cost more than Jessica earned in 3 months. But Jessica didn't care about appearances. All she saw was someone she believed had no right to be in first class. Victoria didn't argue back. She didn't raise her voice or cause a scene. Instead, she sat there with an almost eerie calm, like someone who had witnessed this exact situation before and already knew exactly how it would end. The other passengers watched in uncomfortable silence as Jessica's racist tirade continued. Security guards approached, ready to forcibly remove Victoria from her seat. The tension in that cabin became thick enough to cut with a knife. But then Victoria did something that changed everything. She pulled out her phone with the kind of quiet confidence that should have sent warning bells through Jessica's head. Victoria made one simple call, her voice steady and professional as she spoke just 10 words. That was it, one phone call. 10 words that sent shockwaves through the entire cabin. Jessica's angry red face drained to ghostly white in seconds. The security guards froze in their tracks. The passengers who had been watching this discrimination unfold suddenly realized they were witnessing something much more significant than a simple seating dispute. Because Jessica Matthews, in all her racist fury, had just made the biggest mistake of her entire life. She had absolutely no idea who she was screaming at. She had no clue that those 10 words would cost her everything. Her job, her reputation, and her entire future in the aviation industry. The woman she tried to humiliate and remove from first class wasn't just any passenger. And that phone call? It was about to expose a truth so shocking that it would leave Jessica and everyone else on that plane completely speechless. If you stand against racism and injustice, hit the subscribe button and type yes in the comments. Only those who support it will not type. But before we reveal the devastating truth that made Jessica's world come crashing down, before we show you exactly who Victoria Williams really was and why that single phone call sent everyone into a complete panic, we need to understand how this confrontation started. The heated argument erupted at 35,000 feet in the air, inside a luxury private jet, where the leather seats cost more than most people's annual salary. To understand how this explosive confrontation happened, we need to meet the woman who would change everything with just one phone call. Victoria Williams was 42 years old and had accomplished something most people could only dream of. She was the self-made billionaire CEO of Williams Aviation Holdings, the company that owned the very private jet where this discrimination was taking place. But Victoria's journey to the top hadn't been easy. She grew up in the projects of Atlanta, where dreams of owning anything, let alone a billion-dollar aviation empire, seemed impossible. Victoria built her fortune from absolutely nothing, working her way up through an industry that discriminated against her twice over, once for being black, and again for being a woman. Every contract she won, every plane she purchased, every employee she hired was a victory against a system designed to keep people like her out. Victoria was known for being quiet and observant, the kind of person who watched and listened before making her move. She valued dignity and respect above everything else, probably because she had fought so hard to earn both. Those who knew her described her as someone who never forgot where she came from, and who never let success change her core values. But here's what made Victoria truly dangerous to people like Jessica. She made it her mission to personally inspect her company's operations. 4 times a year, without warning, Victoria would book flights under her maiden name, Victoria Johnson, and travel incognito to see how her employees really treated passengers when they thought the boss wasn't watching. Now let's talk about Jessica Matthews, the flight attendant whose racist outburst was about to destroy her career. Jessica was 35 years old and had worked for Williams Aviation Holdings for 12 years. She was the head flight attendant, experienced and confident in her position. But Jessica carried something toxic with her every single day. Deep-seated racist beliefs that she had learned growing up in a small, conservative town where prejudice was passed down like a family recipe. The disturbing truth about Jessica was that her racism wasn't born from desperation or financial stress. She was recently divorced, but financially stable. Her discrimination came from something much more insidious. She genuinely believed her prejudices were justified. In her mind, treating black passengers differently wasn't bias. It was just common sense. She had spent 12 years perfecting the art of polite discrimination, using her position of authority to make minorities feel unwelcome while maintaining plausible deniability. Jessica had become comfortable in her prejudices because, for 12 years, she had never faced any real consequences for her behavior. Then there was Richard Peterson, the 52-year-old white investor who would play a crucial role in this story. Peterson was everything wrong with old money privilege wrapped up in an expensive suit. He came from a family that had never worked for anything, inheriting wealth that had been built on the backs of others generations ago. Peterson was entitled, demanding, and used to getting his way simply because of his bank account. He was also Victoria's biggest client, representing a contract worth millions of dollars annually. Peterson flew with Williams Aviation Holdings regularly and had grown accustomed to being treated like royalty by staff who feared losing his business. The flight crew that day included Captain Sarah Chen, a 41-year-old veteran pilot with 20 years of flying experience. Sarah was mixed race and had faced her own share of discrimination early in her career. She had learned to be professional and diplomatic, but there was a line she wouldn't cross when it came to tolerating injustice. The co-pilot was David Thompson, just 29 years old and relatively new to the company. David was the kind of person who avoided conflict at all costs, partly because he desperately needed this job to support his sick mother. He had learned to keep his head down and stay out of workplace drama, even when his conscience told him otherwise. Now here's where the story gets interesting. On this particular day, Victoria decided it was time for one of her surprise inspections. She booked her ticket under her maiden name, Victoria Johnson, and dressed in her usual understated but expensive style. Victoria wanted to see how her staff treated passengers when they thought no one important was watching. When Victoria boarded her own plane, Jessica saw exactly what her prejudiced mind expected to see. A well-dressed black woman who, in Jessica's racist worldview, clearly didn't belong in first class. Jessica's brain immediately started creating explanations that fit her biased narrative. Jessica looked at Victoria's designer clothes and expensive jewelry and convinced herself that Victoria was probably someone's assistant who had been given a ticket by her employer. Or maybe she was a woman who had gotten lucky with a wealthy boyfriend who was treating her to a nice flight. In Jessica's prejudiced mind, there was simply no way a black woman could have earned first-class treatment on her own merit. If you're shocked by how casually racist Jessica's assumptions were, hit that subscribe button because this story is about to get so much more intense. Jessica had no idea that the woman she was about to discriminate against owned the plane, employed every person on the crew, and had the power to end careers with a single phone call. She had no clue that her 12 years of unchecked racism was about to come to a devastating end. What assumptions do you think people make about successful black women in luxury settings? Share your thoughts in the comments because this story is about to show exactly why those assumptions are so dangerous. The stage was set for a confrontation that would expose the ugly truth about discrimination in the aviation industry, And Victoria Williams was about to teach everyone on that plane a lesson they would never forget. What happened next was a masterclass in how discrimination can escalate from subtle microaggressions to outright racism in just a matter of minutes. The moment Victoria settled into her first-class seat, Jessica's prejudiced mind went into overdrive. But here's the thing about people like Jessica. They don't usually start with obvious racism. They begin with what they call being helpful, or just asking questions. It's a calculated approach that allows them to discriminate while maintaining plausible deniability. Jessica approached Victoria with that fake smile that service workers perfect when they're about to do something terrible. Her voice dripped with condescending sweetness as she said, "Honey, are you sure you're in the right section?" The word honey wasn't a term of endearment. It was a power play. A way to infantilize a grown woman and establish dominance. Victoria looked up calmly and showed Jessica her boarding pass. Any reasonable flight attendant would have apologized and moved on. But Jessica wasn't reasonable. She was a woman whose racism had been enabled for 12 years, and she was just getting started. "Oh, sweetie," Jessica continued, her voice getting more patronizing by the second, "I think you'd be much more comfortable in coach. The seats back there are really nice too, and honestly, they're probably more your style." The pause before style was deliberate. Jessica knew exactly what she was implying, and she wanted Victoria to know it too. But Victoria didn't take the bait. She remained perfectly composed, her hands folded in her lap, studying Jessica like a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. What Jessica didn't realize was that Victoria was mentally taking notes for what would become the most important employee evaluation of her career. Jessica's next question revealed just how deep her prejudices ran. "Are you traveling alone, sweetie? Where's your employer?" The assumption was clear. In Jessica's racist worldview, a black woman in first class couldn't possibly be traveling on her own merit. She had to be someone's employee, assistant, or dependent. When Victoria simply replied that she was traveling alone on business, Jessica's mask started to slip. "Business?" she repeated with barely concealed skepticism. "What kind of business?" The way she said it made it clear she thought Victoria was lying. Victoria gave a small smile and said she was in aviation. This should have been Jessica's first warning sign, but her racism had made her blind to obvious clues. "Aviation?" Jessica laughed, actually laughed, as if the idea was absurd. "Well, I'm sure whoever bought your ticket meant well, but this is the executive section. It's really reserved for actual business executives and company owners." The irony was so thick, you could cut it with a knife. Here was Jessica, a flight attendant, telling the actual owner of the airline that she didn't belong in first class because she couldn't possibly be a business executive. Victoria's eyes never left Jessica's face as she absorbed every word, every tone, every micro-expression. She was building a case, documenting behavior, and watching her employee reveal exactly who she really was when she thought there were no consequences. But Jessica wasn't done. Her comments became more personal and more revealing of her deep-seated prejudices. "I mean, don't get me wrong," she said with fake kindness. "I'm sure you're very hardworking. But there are certain standards we have to maintain here. Our regular passengers expect a certain environment." The coded language was obvious to everyone except Jessica, who thought she was being subtle. She was basically saying that black passengers made white passengers uncomfortable, and that was somehow Victoria's problem to solve. Then everything changed when Richard Peterson arrived. Peterson stormed onto the plane 20 minutes late, his entitled energy filling the cabin like toxic gas. He was the kind of man who had never heard the word no in his entire privileged life, and today was not going to be the day that changed. "What the hell is this?" Peterson demanded when he saw Victoria in what he considered his seat. He didn't address Victoria directly. In his mind, she wasn't worth speaking to. Instead, he turned to Jessica, like she was a manager, and he was complaining about defective merchandise. "I specifically requested my usual seat," Peterson said, his voice dripping with entitlement. "I've been flying with this airline for years, and I expect certain standards to be maintained." This was the moment when Jessica's true nature emerged completely. She had found an ally, someone who shared her prejudices and had the social status to make her feel justified in her discrimination. "Mr. Peterson, I am so sorry," Jessica gushed, transforming instantly from condescending flight attendant to eager accomplice. "I've been trying to resolve this situation, but some people just don't understand how things work." Peterson looked at Victoria for the first time, and his expression was pure disgust. "Diversity hires," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "They're taking seats from real business people now. What's next? Are we going to have homeless people in first class too?" Jessica actually giggled at this cruel comment. The sound was chilling. Here was a woman finding genuine joy in the dehumanization of another human being. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Peterson," Jessica agreed eagerly. "Some people just don't belong in certain spaces, no matter what their ticket says." The two of them began bonding over their shared racism, each comment making the other bolder and more confident. They fed off each other's prejudice like a feedback loop of hate, and Victoria sat there watching it all unfold with that same calm expression. But their alliance emboldened Jessica to take things to the next level. She decided it was time to involve security. Jessica pressed the button that would summon security to the cabin. And then she did something truly despicable. She lied. When the security guards arrived, she claimed that Victoria was becoming aggressive and refusing to follow crew instructions. 2 security guards boarded the plane. The first was James, a thoughtful man in his 40s who had clearly seen this type of situation before and didn't like it. The second was Rodriguez, who seemed eager to flex his authority and didn't ask too many questions. "Ma'am," James said to Victoria, his tone respectful but cautious, "we're going to need you to come with us." Victoria looked up at him with those same calm eyes and asked, "What exactly am I being accused of?" Jessica jumped in before James could answer. "She's been disruptive since she boarded," Jessica lied smoothly. "Arguing with crew members, refusing to follow instructions, creating a disturbance for other passengers." None of this was true, and James seemed to sense something was off. He looked around the cabin, taking in the scene. Other passengers were watching the confrontation with varying degrees of comfort and disgust. In the back, a young black businesswoman named Angela had pulled out her phone and started recording. She knew exactly what she was witnessing, and she wanted evidence. Angela had probably experienced similar discrimination herself, and understood the importance of documentation. Near the front, an elderly white couple, the Hendersons, whispered to each other with disapproving looks. But their disapproval seemed to be aimed at the situation itself, rather than Jessica's behavior. They were uncomfortable, but not uncomfortable enough to speak up. A teenage girl named Emma sat frozen in her seat, looking horrified by what she was witnessing, but too intimidated to say anything. She kept looking around, hoping an adult would intervene, but the adults were all finding reasons to mind their own business. Even the flight crew members were exchanging uncomfortable glances, but none of them had the courage to challenge Jessica's authority. They were caught between their conscience and their careers were winning. This is exactly how discrimination thrives, not just through the actions of obvious racists like Jessica, but through the silence of people who know better but choose to do nothing. James, the security guard, seemed to be the only person besides Victoria who was thinking clearly. "Ma'am," he said to Victoria, "has there been some kind of misunderstanding here?" But before Victoria could answer, Rodriguez, the more aggressive security guard, stepped forward. "Look, lady, you can either move to another seat voluntarily, or we can escort you off the plane. Your choice." The threat was clear, and it was exactly what Jessica had been hoping for. She had successfully weaponized security against an innocent passenger, and she was clearly enjoying every moment of it. This was when Jessica's racism reached its breaking point. Emboldened by Peterson's support and the presence of security, she dropped all pretense of politeness. People like you need to understand that there are rules and hierarchies in this world, Jessica said, her voice now openly hostile. You can't just show up anywhere and expect to be treated like you belong. The mask was completely off now. This wasn't about tickets or seating arrangements. This was about a racist woman using her position of power to put a black woman in her place. But Jessica wasn't done. She looked at Victoria's expensive designer handbag and said, "I'm sure that bag is nice, but we both know you probably got it from some man. That doesn't mean you can afford to fly first class." The assumption was as disgusting as it was revealing. In Jessica's mind, a black woman with expensive things must have gotten them through sexual favors rather than her own success. It was a stereotype rooted in both racism and sexism, and Jessica delivered it with the confidence of someone who had never been challenged. "I'm going to give you one last chance," Jessica continued, her voice rising. "You can move to coach voluntarily, or I'm going to have you arrested for trespassing and disrupting a flight." The threat of arrest was the final escalation. Jessica was now using the full weight of the legal system to enforce her racism, turning law enforcement into a weapon against an innocent passenger. If you want to see how this incredible story of justice and instant karma unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now, because what happened next will absolutely blow your mind. Throughout this entire ordeal, Victoria had maintained her composure with almost superhuman patience. But for the first time, something shifted in her expression. It wasn't anger. It was something much more devastating. It was disappointment. Victoria looked at Jessica with the expression of someone who had hoped for better, but wasn't surprised by what she found. It was the look of a person who had built a company specifically to combat this kind of discrimination, only to discover it was happening right under her nose. "Is that your final decision?" Victoria asked quietly, her voice still calm but carrying a weight that should have warned everyone in that cabin that they were about to witness something extraordinary. Jessica, still drunk on her own power and Peterson's encouragement, smiled triumphantly. "Yes, it is. Security, please remove this passenger immediately." Have you ever witnessed discrimination this blatant in real life? Let me know in the comments, because what happened next was about to change everything. Victoria Williams reached for her phone, and the nightmare that Jessica had created for herself was about to become very, very real. What happened next was like watching a slow-motion train wreck where everyone except the conductor could see the disaster coming. While Jessica was still basking in her racist triumph, and security was preparing to remove Victoria from the plane, Captain Sarah Chen entered the cabin for her routine pre-flight safety checks. Sarah was focused on her clipboard, running through her standard procedures, when something made her look up. Her eyes landed on Victoria, and she froze mid-step. Sarah did a complete double-take, her professional composure cracking for just a moment as recognition dawned on her face. She knew that face. She had seen it in company newsletters, at corporate events, and in the framed photo that hung in the employee break room at headquarters. Sarah's heart started racing as she realized she was looking at Victoria Williams, the owner and CEO of the entire company. The woman who signed her paychecks. The woman who had personally hired her 5 years ago after other airlines had passed her over because of discrimination. Sarah caught Victoria's eye, and the two women shared a look that spoke volumes. Victoria's expression was calm but meaningful, and she gave Sarah the slightest shake of her head, a subtle signal that said, "Not yet." Sarah understood immediately. This was one of Victoria's legendary surprise inspections, and she was witnessing her boss being discriminated against by her own employees. The realization hit Sarah like a freight train. Victoria Williams, the woman who had built this company from nothing specifically to create a discrimination-free environment, was sitting in her own plane being subjected to the exact kind of racism she had spent decades fighting against. Sarah's mind raced as she tried to process what she was witnessing. She knew about Victoria's quarterly inspections, but she had never seen one in action. Now she understood why Victoria did them. This was exactly the kind of behavior that would never happen if employees knew the boss was watching. But while Sarah was having her moment of recognition, Jessica was completely oblivious. She was too caught up in her power trip, too intoxicated by Peterson's validation, and too confident in her own authority to notice the panic spreading across her captain's face. That's when Victoria made the phone call that would change everything. Victoria pulled out her phone with the same calm demeanor she had maintained throughout the entire ordeal. Her voice was quiet and professional as she dialed, but every word she spoke was like a nail in Jessica's professional coffin. "It's Victoria," she said simply, as if she was ordering coffee instead of destroying careers. "Yes, I'm on flight 247. The name Victoria should have meant something to Jessica, but she was too busy gloating to pay attention. She was still talking to Peterson about how satisfying it felt to put people in their place. Victoria continued her conversation with deadly calm. "Cancel everything with Peterson Industries. All contracts, all future bookings, effective immediately." These words were spoken quietly, but they carried the weight of millions of dollars in lost business. Peterson Industries wasn't just any client. They were Victoria's biggest account, representing a massive portion of the company's annual revenue. With those words, Victoria had just sacrificed her most profitable relationship for the sake of her principles. But Victoria wasn't finished. "And prepare the emergency board meeting for Monday," she added. "We have some serious personnel issues to address." The emergency board meeting was corporate speak for "heads are going to roll." Victoria was calling an emergency session to discuss the discrimination happening on her own aircraft, and everyone involved was about to face consequences they couldn't imagine. Jessica was still completely oblivious to what was happening right behind her. She was too busy celebrating her perceived victory with Peterson, too intoxicated by the feeling of exercising power over someone she considered beneath her. But Captain Chen had heard every word of Victoria's phone call, and the color drained from her face like she had seen a ghost. Sarah understood the implications immediately. Her boss had just canceled their biggest client contract while sitting on her own plane being discriminated against by her own employees. Sarah tried desperately to get Jessica's attention, making subtle gestures and meaningful looks, but Jessica was completely focused on her racist performance. Sarah even cleared her throat loudly and tried to position herself in Jessica's line of sight, but Jessica was too caught up in her power trip to notice. In the cockpit, co-pilot David Thompson had been monitoring the radio communications when he heard Victoria identify herself by name. David's eyes went wide as he recognized Victoria Williams from all the company communications, employee handbooks, and corporate memos he had read. David immediately understood what was happening, and he started to panic. He knew his job was probably safe since he hadn't participated in the discrimination. But he also knew he was witnessing a career-ending disaster for his colleagues. Word started spreading quietly among the flight crew as they began to realize what they were witnessing. Glances were exchanged, whispers were shared, and a sense of dread began to fill the cabin. Everyone except Jessica and Peterson understood that they were watching a catastrophe unfold in real time. But Jessica was completely blind to the growing tension around her. She was riding high on her racist power trip, feeling validated by Peterson's support and emboldened by what she perceived as her victory over Victoria. That's when Peterson decided to make things even worse. "You know what I appreciate about you, Jessica?" Peterson said, his voice dripping with entitled satisfaction. "You understand that there are natural hierarchies in this world. Some people are just born better than others." His comment was so overtly racist that even some of the passengers who had been staying silent started shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But Peterson wasn't done. "Look at her," Peterson continued, gesturing dismissively toward Victoria. "Probably never worked a real job in her life. Probably got everything handed to her through affirmative action and government handouts. People like that think they can just waltz into spaces meant for their betters." Jessica laughed. Actually laughed at Peterson's disgusting comments. The sound was chilling, the laughter of someone who found genuine joy in the dehumanization of another human being. "You're absolutely right, Mr. Peterson," Jessica agreed enthusiastically. "And look at how she's dressed, trying so hard to fit in where she doesn't belong. That designer outfit is probably fake anyway. Women like her always try to dress above their station." The comments were getting more personal and more cruel by the minute. Jessica felt emboldened by Peterson's approval and was showing her true colors in the most horrific way possible. "I bet she bought that handbag with her welfare check," Peterson added with a smirk. "Or maybe she's some rapper's girlfriend trying to play businesswoman for the day." Both of them were now making assumptions about Victoria's appearance, her background, her intelligence, and her worth as a human being. They were reducing a brilliant, accomplished woman to racist stereotypes, while she sat just feet away from them. But they weren't finished. Peterson leaned in closer to Jessica and said, "This is exactly why we need to maintain standards. Give these people an inch, and they'll take a mile. Next thing you know, they'll think they own the place." The irony was so perfect, it was almost poetic. Here was Peterson talking about maintaining standards while being completely unaware that these people actually did own the place. Jessica nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what I've been trying to explain to her," she said. "Some people need to learn their place in the world. There are rules and hierarchies for a reason." Their conversation had devolved into the kind of openly racist dialogue that most people keep private. They felt safe expressing their true beliefs because they thought they were among like-minded people in a space where they held all the power. But while they were bonding over their shared hatred, Victoria had heard enough. Victoria stood up from her seat with a dignity and grace that made everyone else in the cabin look small by comparison. She didn't storm off or make a scene. She simply rose with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she was worth. As Victoria began walking toward the cockpit, Jessica couldn't resist one final moment of triumph. She turned to the other passengers with a satisfied smile and announced loudly, "Some people just don't know their place in this world. But don't worry, folks. We'll have this situation resolved shortly." If you're enjoying the story, hit that subscribe button, because the justice that's coming will make it all worth it. Jessica had no idea that the woman she had just spent the last hour humiliating was about to teach her the most expensive lesson of her entire life. She had no clue that her victim was actually her boss, and that every racist word she had spoken was being mentally documented for the termination letter that was already being written in Victoria's mind. If you were in Victoria's shoes, would you have stood up from the seat, or would you remain on the seat no matter what? Drop your thoughts in the comments. What happened next was the most satisfying moment of justice you will ever witness. Captain Sarah Chen walked back into the cabin with Victoria by her side, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. You could feel the tension in the air as Sarah prepared to deliver news that would shatter Jessica's world completely. Sarah's voice was shaking, not from fear, but from the weight of what she was about to reveal. She cleared her throat and addressed the entire cabin with the kind of announcement that changes lives forever. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her words carrying across the silent cabin, "I'd like you to meet Victoria Williams." The name hung in the air for a moment. Jessica heard it but didn't immediately understand the significance. She was still riding high on her racist victory, still feeling validated by Peterson's support. But Sarah wasn't finished. Victoria Williams is the owner and CEO of Williams Aviation Holdings, the company that owns this aircraft. The words hit the cabin like a bomb. Jessica's triumphant smile began to fade as the implications started to sink in. "And employs every single person on this crew," Sarah concluded, her voice getting stronger as she delivered the final blow. The silence that followed was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop in that cabin as everyone processed what they had just learned. The woman Jessica had spent the last hour humiliating, discriminating against, and trying to have arrested was actually her boss. Not just her supervisor, her ultimate boss, the person who owned everything. Jessica's face underwent a transformation that was almost supernatural. The color drained from her skin so quickly she looked like she was about to faint. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. For the first time in over an hour, Jessica Matthews was completely speechless. That's impossible," Jessica finally stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "She can't be. I mean, she's—" Jessica couldn't even finish her sentences. Her brain was short-circuiting as it tried to process the magnitude of her mistake. But if Jessica was in shock, Peterson was in complete panic. The realization hit him like a freight train. He had just spent the last hour insulting, degrading, and making racist comments about the CEO of his biggest aviation contractor. Not only had he lost the contract that Victoria had already canceled during her phone call, but he had done it in the most spectacular and humiliating way possible. Peterson's entitled arrogance evaporated instantly, replaced by the desperate scrambling of a man watching his business relationships crumble in real time. "Miss Williams," he started, his voice taking on a pathetic, pleading tone, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I didn't realize." But Victoria silenced him with a single look. She didn't need to raise her voice or make threats. Her presence alone commanded absolute attention. The security guards who had been so eager to remove Victoria from the plane now looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Rodriguez, the aggressive guard who had threatened to escort Victoria off the plane, was visibly sweating as he realized he had just threatened to arrest the owner of the airline. Even James, the sympathetic security guard who had hesitated throughout the ordeal, looked mortified that he had been part of this situation at all. The passengers who had watched the discrimination unfold in silence were now experiencing their own moment of reckoning. They realized they had witnessed something terrible and done nothing to stop it. The guilt was written all over their faces. But Angela, the young black businesswoman who had been recording everything, continued to document the aftermath. She understood the historical significance of what she was witnessing. A moment of justice that needed to be preserved and shared. Victoria stepped forward and addressed the cabin with the calm authority of someone who had earned every ounce of respect she commanded. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of experience, wisdom, and absolute moral certainty. Victoria turned to Jessica first, her voice steady and professional. "Jessica Matthews, you are terminated immediately. Your employment with Williams Aviation Holdings is over, effective this moment. Security will escort you off this aircraft at our next stop." The words fell like a gavel in a courtroom. Jessica's 12-year career was over, destroyed by her own racism in the span of a single flight. Jessica tried to speak, tried to apologize, tried to explain, but Victoria held up a hand that stopped her cold. "There's nothing you can say that will change this decision. Your behavior today revealed who you truly are, and that person has no place in my company." Victoria then turned to Peterson, and her expression hardened even further. "Mr. Peterson, your contract with Williams Aviation Holdings is void, effective immediately. You are permanently banned from all our aircraft, and any future business relationship between your company and mine is terminated." Peterson's face went from pale to red as the financial implications hit him. He had just lost millions of dollars in aviation services, and there wasn't another company in the industry that could provide the same level of service at the same scale. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, "I will be sharing details of your behavior today with other aviation companies in our network. Your comments were not just offensive, they were a liability that no professional organization should have to endure." Victoria moved on to Rodriguez, the aggressive security guard. "You're fired. Real security officers investigate situations before acting. They ask questions, gather facts, and make informed decisions. You did none of those things. You were ready to arrest an innocent passenger based solely on the word of a racist flight attendant. Rodriguez opened his mouth to protest, but Victoria continued. Security officers are supposed to protect people from discrimination, not enforce it. You failed in the most basic requirements of your job. But Victoria's tone softened when she addressed James, the sympathetic guard. James, thank you for your hesitation throughout this ordeal. Your reluctance to act showed wisdom and good judgment. It showed that you sensed something was wrong with this situation. That instinct will serve you well in your career. James looked relieved, but still shaken by what he had witnessed. Now Victoria addressed the entire cabin, and her words carried the weight of someone who had spent decades fighting discrimination and building something better. What you witnessed today wasn't personal, Victoria began. This was a test of our company culture, and I'm deeply disappointed by what I found. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. I conduct these surprise inspections 4 times a year because I need to know how my employees treat passengers when they think no one important is watching. Today, I discovered that despite all our training, all our policies, and all our stated values, discrimination is still happening on my aircraft. Victoria's voice grew stronger as she continued. This isn't just about me. I'm in a unique position because I own this company, but discrimination affects minority passengers every single day, especially women of color who face the intersection of racism and sexism. She gestured toward the cabin around them. Every person who flies with us deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their race, gender, economic status, or any other characteristic. When my employees discriminate against passengers, they're not just hurting individuals, they're damaging our company's reputation and betraying the values we claim to stand for. Victoria shared her vision with passion and conviction. I built Williams Aviation Holdings specifically to counter the discrimination that exists throughout the aviation industry. I wanted to create a company where everyone, passengers and employees alike, would be judged by their character and treated with respect. She looked directly at Jessica, who was still standing there in shock. Aviation should be accessible and respectful for everyone. It should be a service that brings people together, not a platform for discrimination and prejudice. Victoria explained why she traveled incognito, and her reasoning was both practical and profound. I use a different name and travel without fanfare because I need to see how my employees really behave. When people know the boss is watching, they perform. But I need to know what happens when they think there are no consequences. Her voice took on a more personal tone as she continued. My success story should inspire people, not intimidate them. When employees see a successful Black woman, they should be proud to work for a company that values diversity and excellence. They shouldn't see someone they need to put in their place. Victoria looked around the cabin one more time, making eye contact with passengers and crew members alike. Today's events will be documented, investigated, and used to improve our training and policies. We will do better because we must do better. If you're amazed by Victoria's grace under pressure and her commitment to justice, smash that subscribe button because this story is about to get even more powerful. The silence in the cabin was profound as everyone absorbed the weight of Victoria's words. Jessica stood there like a statue, finally understanding the full magnitude of her actions. Peterson looked like a man who had just watched his empire crumble. The other passengers sat in contemplative silence, many of them probably examining their own complicity in what they had witnessed. But the story wasn't over yet. The consequences of this flight would ripple far beyond the cabin, and the lessons learned would change more than just the people who were there to witness them. YouTube script, Act 5, Resolution and Reflection, 58 to 60 minutes. The aftermath of Victoria's revelation was swift, decisive, and absolutely devastating for those who had chosen to discriminate. When the plane landed at its next scheduled stop, Jessica Matthews was escorted off the aircraft in front of everyone. The walk of shame down that aisle was the longest walk of her life. 12 years of employment, gone. Her reputation in the aviation industry destroyed. Her comfortable salary and benefits terminated. But Jessica's humiliation was just the beginning of her consequences. She faced potential lawsuits not just from the company for violating their anti-discrimination policies, but personal legal action from Victoria herself. Victoria had been personally humiliated, discriminated against, and threatened with arrest, all documented by Angela's recording and witnessed by an entire cabin full of people. Jessica's career in aviation was over. Word spreads quickly in specialized industries, and no airline would risk hiring someone with her track record. She had become a liability that no company could afford. Peterson's reaction to losing his contract was exactly what you'd expect from an entitled, privileged man who had never faced real consequences for his actions. He stormed off the plane, ranting about reverse racism and claiming he was the real victim in the situation. "This is discrimination against white people," Peterson shouted as he gathered his belongings. "I'm going to sue for reverse racism. This is exactly what's wrong with this country." But his words fell completely flat. Everyone in that cabin had witnessed his racist comments and discriminatory behavior. They had heard him bond with Jessica over their shared prejudices. They knew exactly who the real victim was, and it wasn't Richard Peterson. Peterson's rants about reverse racism only served to confirm everything Victoria had said about his character. He was a man who couldn't accept responsibility for his actions, and who would rather blame discrimination laws than examine his own racist behavior. The other staff members who had been complicit in the discrimination faced immediate disciplinary action. The crew members who had stayed silent while watching a passenger be abused were written up and required to attend additional sensitivity training. They kept their jobs, but they understood that their silence had consequences too. But Victoria didn't just focus on punishment. She also believed in recognizing and rewarding good behavior. Captain Sarah Chen, who had maintained her professionalism throughout the ordeal and had tried to signal Jessica to stop her discriminatory behavior, received an immediate promotion. Victoria named her Director of Flight Operations, a position that would allow Sarah to implement company-wide policies and training to prevent future incidents. "Sarah," Victoria told her, "your recognition of what was happening and your attempt to intervene showed exactly the kind of leadership this company needs. You understood the situation immediately and tried to do something about it." James, the sympathetic security guard who had hesitated to arrest Victoria because something felt wrong about the situation, was offered a management position within the company's security division. His instincts and moral compass had served him well, and Victoria wanted to put him in a position where he could train other security personnel. "Your hesitation saved you from making a terrible mistake," Victoria told James. "That kind of wisdom and moral judgment is exactly what we need in our security leadership." But perhaps the most meaningful recognition went to Angela, the young black businesswoman who had recorded the entire incident. Victoria offered her an internship at Williams Aviation Holdings, specifically in their diversity and inclusion department. "You understood the importance of documentation," what Victoria told Angela. "Your recording will help us improve our training and ensure that incidents like this are handled properly in the future. You also showed courage by speaking up when others stayed silent." Even the passengers who had stayed silent during the discrimination were given an opportunity to learn and grow. Victoria arranged for them to participate in voluntary diversity training sessions, not as punishment, but as education. She understood that silence in the face of injustice was often the result of not knowing how to respond, not malicious intent. Then Victoria did something unprecedented. She addressed the camera directly, speaking to the millions of people who would eventually see Angela's recording. "What happened on this flight happens every single day to people who don't own the company," Victoria said, her voice carrying the weight of experience and conviction. People are discriminated against in hotels, restaurants, stores, and airlines across this country simply because of the color of their skin. She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. This discrimination is especially harsh for women of color, who face both racial and gender-based prejudice. We're questioned more, doubted more, and treated as if we don't belong in spaces where we've earned our place. Victoria's message was clear and powerful. We all have a responsibility to speak up when we see discrimination happening. We all have an obligation to treat each other with dignity and respect, regardless of race, gender, or social status. Her final words were perhaps the most important of all. Success isn't about putting others down to lift yourself up. Real success is about lifting everyone up with you. That's how we build a better world. The impact of Victoria's story didn't end when the plane landed. 6 months later, the consequences and changes were still unfolding. Jessica Matthews was working at a small regional airline, struggling professionally and personally. Her new job paid a fraction of what she had earned at Williams Aviation Holdings, and her reputation in the industry was permanently damaged. She was constantly reminded of her mistake every time she went to work. One day, while grabbing coffee during her break, Jessica saw a news report on the television that stopped her in her tracks. The headline read, "Williams Aviation wins major humanitarian contract." The reporter was describing how Victoria's company had been selected to fly medical supplies to underserved communities around the world. It was a multi-million-dollar contract that would not only be incredibly profitable, but would also save countless lives by delivering critical medical aid to places that needed it most. CEO Victoria Williams says this contract represents her company's commitment to ensuring aviation serves everyone equally, the reporter explained. Williams Aviation Holdings has become a model for inclusive business practices in the aviation industry. For the first time, Jessica truly understood what she had cost herself. It wasn't just a job or a salary. She had lost the opportunity to be part of something meaningful. She had lost the chance to work for a company that was making a real difference in the world. Victoria's company had become a beacon of hope and inclusivity in an industry that had historically been dominated by discrimination. Other aviation companies began following Williams Aviation Holdings' lead, implementing similar diversity and inclusion policies after Jessica's story went viral. The video of the incident, recorded by Angela, had been viewed millions of times and had sparked conversations about discrimination across the country. It became a case study in business schools and a training tool for companies in every industry. The message was clear. Real change happens when we refuse to accept discrimination as normal. When leaders like Victoria take a stand and enforce consequences for discriminatory behavior, it sends a message that reverberates throughout entire industries. Victoria's story proved that one person's commitment to justice can create ripple effects that change countless lives. Her refusal to accept the way things are had created a new standard for the way things should be. If this story inspired you and you want to see more examples of justice and positive change, make sure you're subscribed because there are so many more incredible stories like this one. The final lesson of Victoria Williams' story is that we all have the power to create change. Whether we're CEOs or customers, employees or passengers, we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable world. What would you do if you witnessed discrimination like this? How can we all work together to create change in our own communities and industries? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because these conversations are how real progress begins. Victoria Williams didn't just fire a racist employee or cancel a discriminatory client. She created a model for how business leaders can use their power and influence to build a better world for everyone. And that might be the most important lesson of all. If you enjoyed this story, like, subscribe, and share with others so they can learn too. See you in our next video.